thanks everybody for coming out and giving up such a beautiful evening. I feel kind of guilty bringing you all inside a dark building right now, but we're here for a good purpose. We're here to talk about birds, and as Bill said, I've been involved with birds and beans, pretty much from the beginning. And when it did not take a lot of convincing when Bill first reached out to me, because I'd been aware for years about the importance of traditional shade coffee production in Central America in particular, in terms of preserving habitat for migratory birds. And we are at that time of year. My wife and I live in southern New Hampshire now after a lifetime in Pennsylvania. And that's my wife over there, by the way, that's Amy. She works for Mass Audubon, she's also a conservationist. And we were out birding this morning because it's spring migration and the woods are full of birds. And it was wonderful to be, we're staying down in Dorset to hear wood thrushes, which I miss from Pennsylvania. We've got hermit thrushes and Swainson thrushes and veeries at home in New Hampshire, but we don't have wood thrushes, and American redstarts and BT blue warblers and all this stuff pouring north. And that's wonderful, but we can't lose sight of the fact, as these birds are passing through here, that the only reason that we get these birds here is that they're part of this global web of migration and resources and protected land and rich, biodiverse, functioning ecosystems that allow this hemispheric movement of birds back and forth. And the birds are already doing everything they can. I mean, what birds do every year on their migration is incredible. Anybody recognize that one? Blackpoll warbler, absolutely. That's a springtime male. They're coming through right now. I can't hear blackpolls anymore. Those of us of a certain age got the joke there. They're singing at like 13,000 megahertz. But nevertheless, that's what they look like in the springtime. This is what they look like in the fall. That's a fall plumaged blackpoll warbler. And every year, blackpoll warblers breed across the whole boreal forest range of North America. So basically from like Newfoundland all the way across up into Alaska. And if you're a blackpoll warbler, on our study ground in Denali National Park in Alaska, where I've been working with the National Park Service for years to study the migration of blackpoll warblers. In the fall, what you would do is make one or two long, nonstop flights from west to east across all of North America, and then wind up, in late September or early October, somewhere on the northeastern coast. This is a bird that's it's 4.5 inches long, it weighs less than half an ounce. You could mail 2 of these anywhere in the country for a first-class stamp. Don't, please, don't. But that bird is going to spend the winter in the Amazon and the Orinoco Basin in South America, which is astonishing, and it doesn't even go the way you'd think. If I were 4.5 inches long and had to go all the way down there is a perfectly good land bridge to South America, but that's not what these blackpoll warblers do. They wait for a night when a powerful cold front has come through with northwest winds, and they take off out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they fly 3,300 miles nonstop, all the way down. It takes them 4 or 5 days. They will beat their wings something like 7 million times. They're doing all this on a couple of grams of fat stored underneath their skin. If they were burning gasoline instead of fat, they would get 720,000 miles to the gallon. That is fuel efficiency. And if you think that's impressive, consider the bar-tailed godwit. This bird that's about the size of a small duck, a large pigeon. Bar-tailed godwits that breed in western Alaska fly 8,100 miles nonstop across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean to spend the winter in New Zealand and the coast of Australia. It takes them up to 11 days of continuous powered flight. So like I said, the birds are already doing everything that they possibly can. We'll go through the stats here. 18,000 miles a year in this huge hemispheric flight, because in the springtime, by the way, you can't fly back north across the Pacific Ocean the way they can because of headwinds, so they go from New Zealand to the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula, 6,000 miles, and then another 4,500 miles all the way back to Alaska. They're in flight for 22 days. They average about 820 miles a day. So, don't talk to me about human athletes, because the birds leave them in the dust. And as I suspect many of you know, this is a time of crisis for migratory birds. You've probably either read or heard about this paper that was published in 2019 in the journal Science, Ken Rosenberg and some of the top ornithologists in the country, documenting the fact that we've lost about a third of North America's avifauna since 1970. There are 3 billion fewer birds today than when I was a kid growing up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania more than 50 years ago. But we can make a difference for migratory birds. We can make a difference for birds in general. Simple things that we can do in our lives, from the kind of coffee that we drink, to the kind of produce that we buy, the kind of farms that we support, the kind of land management that we have in the forests of New England, and even for species that for years and years and years have been in steep decline, we can bring them back on the road to recovery. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about one really sterling example of that. As these birds are coming back north, we think of these birds coming back home, right? Because they were born here. These birds were hatched in the forests of Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine. But the fact of the matter is these birds spend most of their lives somewhere else. The majority of their time they spend either in migration or on the wintering grounds. These are essentially tropical birds. They're not taking a little short winter vacation down south. They're actually taking a relatively short summer trip up to the north. They're going to their summer home to have their babies, and then in a sense going back where they belong. But along the way, the only reason that they can make these trips north and south is if there's enough food and resources and protected land along the way. And that's becoming harder and harder for birds like this blue-headed vireo. You know, we're in the midst of an insect apocalypse. I was really shocked yesterday, actually 2 days ago now, to be driving down the road and got a big insect splot on the windshield. Those of us who are old enough remember when you drove in the summertime, you were constantly stopping at the gas station to clean your windshield. It doesn't happen anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We've seen you know, this just wave of increasingly nasty insecticides out there, but all across the Western Hemisphere. Here in North America, in Mesoamerica, and in the Caribbean, there are more and more people that are looking for ways to work with the land, looking for ways to work with our ecosystems that are sustainable for us, that are sustainable for nature. Because, to be honest with you, if we can figure out a way to make a world that works for birds, it'll work for everything else. Because birds are so ubiquitous in their movements and so ubiquitous in their migration that if we can figure out how to stabilize and restore bird populations, everything else will fall in place. And I mentioned insecticides a moment ago. One of the things that really terrifies me right now, and I think this is one of the underlying reasons for this insect apocalypse, and that insect apocalypse is trickling down to birds. If there aren't insects, there aren't birds, because birds feed their chicks on insects. Neonicotinoid insecticides, which have just become so ubiquitous, that are water-soluble, that move easily into aquatic systems, have decimated insect populations all around the world. Now, some parts of the world have gotten smart about that. Many parts of Europe and the UK have banned the use of neonicotinoids. We have not figured that out here in the US, and given what's happening these days in Washington, I'm not sure that we're going to figure that out anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that we can't start making choices in our own daily lives to move us away from this chemical dependency. Because if you're a yellow warbler and you got 5 eggs in your nest, when those little babies hatch, it's going to take that pair of yellow warblers, over the course of about 2 weeks, they're going to probably feed somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 caterpillars to those babies. It takes a lot of bugs to raise baby birds. And without bugs, we don't have birds. And so that's why the kind of work that Bill was talking about earlier, the Northeast Organic Farming Association and its 7 member chapters, state chapters, organic farming, if it's done right, restores the sustainability of landscapes. It restores the health and vibrancy of soils. It restores beneficial insect populations. It's good for people. It's good for bugs. It's good for birds. I'm not an expert on organic farming. So if you have questions about NOFA, I would suggest you talk to Bill or go on NOFA's website. But this is one of the, what they're trying to do essentially is come up with a true organic standard. The USDA organic system has been gamed, quite frankly, in a lot of ways that are disturbing. It's an okay benchmark, but we can do so much better in terms of organic farming. But I want to turn our attention right now to Central America, because these birds that are coming back, for the most part, as Bill said before, you think about the disparity in in land area between North America and then down into Central America, southern Mexico, Central America, northern South America, and the Caribbean. The vast majority of our migratory birds are going right in there. So you get this enormous landmass that's funneling down there. So what happens in Mesoamerica, what happens in the islands of the Greater Antilles and southern Mexico and northern Central America is critical to birds like the Swainson's thrush that are wintering down in those areas. Bill touched on this a little bit. Back in the 1980s, scientists like Russell Greenberg, who was working at the time at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, I think, like many people in those days, became aware of the rapidity of tropical deforestation and habitat loss that was happening in the neotropics. I remember vividly how we all had this kind of come to Jesus moment where we sort of woke up one day and realized how bad things were getting down there. And so Russ Greenberg, who unfortunately passed away from pancreatic cancer at a much too young age, was working down in the tropics, and he and his colleagues were studying what habitats were most important to birds in the neotropics. What habitats should we be focusing on trying to protect and preserve down there if we're going to protect these migratory birds? And one of the things that they realized pretty quickly is that these traditional rustic shade coffee plantations are some of the best habitat both for wintering birds and also for migrants that are passing through. So birds that are using them as stopover sites if they're moving farther south into Latin America, or birds that are going to spend the whole winter there. And if I show you these pictures, and I ask you to pick out pictures that show a crop under cultivation, well, I mean, obviously, right? The one where everything's planted in a straight row. But the fact is, all three of these show coffee under cultivation. The other two are traditional rustic shade coffee plantations, where the farmer goes into an intact, functioning, biodiverse forest and plants these widely scattered coffee shrubs where the coffee ripens slowly. Bill touched on this. It develops these complexities of aroma and taste and flavor. That's the way coffee was raised in Latin America for many, many generations. Unfortunately, as Bill said, big agriculture doesn't like to do things that way. And that's been a problem for birds because there are literally hundreds of species of migratory birds, mostly songbirds, but also including migratory raptors like broadwinged hawks, that use these habitats either as, I said, stopover habitat en route to and from, or as their primary wintering habitat. So birds like Baltimore oriole, blue-headed vireo, chestnut-sided warblers, there were so many chestnut-sided warblers singing this morning, western tanagers from further out west. And these are small family-owned farms. That's the other important part of this. As Bill said, it's as much about the people as it is about the birds. These farms, this is a complex form of agroforestry where it's not just the coffee. They're growing a lot of other things in these forests. They're growing cacao. That's a cacao pod that Marvin has split open in his hand that we get coffee from. Vanilla orchids that can grow on the trees that are providing the shade to the forest. Cut flowers. Even the wood that is pruned from the coffee shrubs, because they have to be pruned on a regular basis, has value. In fact, there was actually kind of a spree for a while. Europe was just mad about furniture made from coffee. It's these weird shapes for it. So what we're doing is we're preserving not just bird habitat, we're preserving family farms. But unfortunately, what's been happening increasingly in the tropics is large agribusiness coming in, buying up the land, bulldozing the forest, planting enormous areas of sun-tolerant coffee, soaking the land in herbicides and insecticides and fungicides and chemical fertilizers, basically turning what had been a rich biodiverse landscape into the ecological value of a parking lot. And that has consequences for birds. We've lost somewhere in excess of about 40% of the traditional shade coffee plantations in Latin America. And we're the ones driving that. Americans drink about 1/3 of the world's coffee supply. And we like cheap coffee. And Americans are famously cheap about that. And so by choosing the wrong coffee, we're driving the destruction of these tropical habitats that our birds depend on. So the bad news is Americans drink 1/3 of the world's coffee. The good news is Americans drink 1/3 of the world's coffee. And so Russ Greenberg and his colleagues at Smithsonian realized if we can get people to start buying the right coffee, if we can get them to start buying traditionally grazed shade coffee, we can preserve and even restore bird habitat in the neotropics. And so that was the birth of Smithsonian's bird-friendly certification program. It's by far the most rigorous certification program out there. Right off the bat, it requires USDA organic certification. Just because a coffee is certified organic does not mean it's shade grown. It does not mean it's good for birds. And there is just a raft of peer-reviewed science to show that shade coffee farms that qualify for Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center bird-friendly certification are really, in terms of not just birds, but orchid and bee and herp and almost every other measure of biodiversity around, almost as good as virgin forest. And this is what a bird-friendly landscape looks like. These are the mountains of northern Nicaragua, up near the town of San Juan del Rio Coco. A lot of birds and beans coffee comes out of San Juan del Rio Coco. And everything you see to the horizon in this picture is a certified Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center bird-friendly coffee plantation. You wouldn't think it. It looks like forest because that's the beauty of traditional shade coffee. Now, I keep saying traditional shade coffee because you can bulldoze a mountain and plant coffee and then plant a few widely scattered eucalyptus trees and call that shade-grown coffee. And there's more than a few places that do that, which is why the certification is important. Smithsonian certification, the bird-friendly certification, it's a third-party certification. Smithsonian really isn't making a buck off this. There are other certification programs out there where that's the moneymaker for the organization. So, I mean, I'm just going to be honest with you, the Rainforest Alliance, the Little Green Tree Frog, they will certify as shade-grown a bag of coffee where only 30% of the beans in the bag actually came from a shade coffee farm. If you want to buy coffee that is going to make the most bang for the buck for the birds, it's going to be bird-friendly. And the beauty of this is the premium price that the farmers are getting for this is allowing them not just to preserve their farms, and I've seen this on a couple of trips down to Nicaragua, where they're actually taking old, formerly degraded land, old cattle pastures and grain fields, and revegetating it with native trees and native shrubs, and creating new shade coffee plantations, but also creating new bird habitat. And so when you seek out and buy Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee, like birds and beans, you're actually driving the creation of additional bird habitat in Latin America. And you're preserving not just the migrant birds, because it's about more than just migrant birds. You're also preserving habitat for the resident tropical birds. So not just bay-breasted warbler and cerulean warbler, but blue-gray tanager and this gorgeous violet saberwing hummingbirds. These are all shot down in, well, the tanager and the saberwing were shot down in Nicaragua. Those birds leave Latin America, start moving north, and of course, you know, they run into problems. And we're seeing this increasingly in the mid-Atlantic, in southern New England, where the habitat that these birds have returned to generation after generation is just not there anymore. This increasing urbanization is having problems, which means that a little bit farther to the north, when you get up into New England, where you've got these expansive forests in Vermont and New Hampshire and parts of Maine, and the boreal forest in Canada even farther north, this is increasingly critical as nesting habitat for these birds. Now, there's a lot of forest in New England, but it's not necessarily all the right kind of forest in the right place in the right quantity to be as beneficial for these birds as possible. You think about the history of forests up here in New England. In the late 18th and into the early 19th century, much of New England had been completely cleared for farming. I mean, hillsides that you couldn't even believe anybody would think that they would farm. And in the century and a half or so since then, those forests have grown back, but they've grown back in a very uniform way. The same age trees, not a lot of structural complexity, not a lot of biological complexity. And we're coming to understand that is a significant problem for the birds that breed in those forests, what are known as forest interior species, like scarlet tanager, rose-breasted grosbeak, wood thrush. These are birds that tend to nest deep in the interiors of unfragmented forests. And Again, back in the 1980s, when Russ Greenberg and his team were starting to work down in the tropics, a lot of ornithologists who were also at that point becoming alarmed at the rapid decline in many of these forest interior species, they realized that there was a problem when these forests got broken into pieces. As what had been a large blanket of forest got broken into smaller and smaller pieces. And they were studying these birds, and probably the best example of this is the wood thrush. Listening to wood thrushes this morning. I wish we had wood thrushes in our backyard in New Hampshire, but our hermit thrushes aren't bad. This is a bird that for years has been in steep decline. For example, based on breeding bird survey data, since 1966, we've lost about 50% of North America's wood thrush population. The numbers just keep going down, have just been going down year after year after year. If you want to look at it a little bit more closely at the Vermont level, through about 2010, and by the way, on that map, I should say, oops, there we go. That breeding bird survey map, everything that's in orange or yellow or red are declining populations of wood thrushes in 2010. Anything in blue is increasing, and you can see there's not a lot of blue on that map. And looking specifically at Vermont, also up through about 2010, just continual erosion in wood thrush numbers. So what's going on here? Well, scientists began to look at how forest size affected the nesting success of these birds. Because you can find wood thrushes during the nesting season, you can find their nests. It's relatively easy to keep track of how many eggs do they have, how many chicks hatch, how many chicks survive to fledging. And they found that there was a pretty tight correlation between the success of the nest and where the bird was in the forest. That basically the farther away it was from edges of the forest, the better, the higher the nesting success. Now, once the chicks leave the nest, it is really hard if you've got 4 or 5 baby birds in a nest and they all scatter like quail in different directions, keeping track of those. And you can put radio transmitters on them, but to be honest with you, scientists were really nervous about putting any kind of an extra device on a baby bird. So they didn't really know what happened to these birds once they left their nest. But in recent years, thanks to hyper-miniaturization of radio transmitters, so I mean, some of them are now small enough you can put them on not just hummingbirds, you can put them on monarch butterflies and track their migration. Once scientists started tagging these baby wood thrushes, they discovered that they pull a big switcheroo. As soon as they leave the nest deep in these interior forests, these birds move to early successional forest, to thickets, places where there's tons of native fruit-producing trees and shrubs, like this is arrowwood viburnum. Those blueberries are full of lipids and fats that are the perfect food for birds that are getting ready to take their first migration. So these forest interior species are leaving the deep forests and they're moving to these thickets. The problem is there's not a lot of thickets out there. As I said before, you know, in the 150 or 200 years since New England started to revegetate, we've grown a very dense blanket of relatively uniformly aged forest. The least common habitat type in New England is early successional forest, the kind of stuff that grows up after you've cut down trees. Because we don't like cutting down trees. We've been taught that cutting down trees is bad. The problem is these birds evolved in a landscape that was a habitat mosaic. These old growth forests where you had huge areas with enormous trees and closed canopies, but also where an enormous tree would have come down and opened up a light gap, and you would have had a thicket coming up. You had indigenous communities all across the Northeast using fire to manage the landscape, something that I think we're only just slowly starting to understand now as the archaeology gets better, and as we actually start listening to indigenous communities that still live in New England, who have been doing this for 10,000 years. Dead snags, falls, what are known as coarse woody debris when trees fall and aren't hauled off to a lumber mill. It's easy in a structurally complex, biodiverse forest of the kind that we had here in pre-colonial times for these birds to shift from a place where they were able to nest in safety and move these young birds, because they can't fly very far, into the kind of habitat they need to successfully grow, lay on the fat they need for their migration, and move. Now, we can't chronologically recreate old-growth forests here in the Northeast. But we can mimic the structural complexity and the biological complexity and the function of those old-growth forests with intelligent forestry techniques. And like I said, we've been taught that cutting down trees is bad. And I just want to make clear, I am not talking about this. Nobody's talking about industrial grade clear cuts like this is the Pacific Northwest, but you get the idea. What we're talking about is intelligent forest management with the idea of creating a landscape that is less even and less uniform and more structurally biologically complex. And Merck Forest and Farmland Center is doing this. And I want to show you some pictures from up there. We're going to be over at Merck tomorrow, giving a talk as well. And Rob Carey, who's the executive director over there, took some photographs and sent them to me. So this is an area where they've been working with professors from University of Vermont and also UMass. The idea here is to start to mimic some of the structure and function of those old-growth forests by opening up small light gaps, leaving dead standing snags. Dead trees are more alive sometimes than live trees are when it comes to wildlife. Leaving debris on the ground, leaving both what's called fine woody debris and coarse woody debris on the ground. That stuff starts to rot. It creates cover. It creates habitat for insects, which the birds need. And while Rob was taking these pictures, he was running the Merlin app on his phone and keeping track of what species of birds were singing around him. And he had, I think in that case, he had about 15 species of birds. We had their black and white warbler, Nashville warbler, ovenbird, wood thrush, hermit thrush, black-throated blue warbler, Baltimore oriole, rose-breasted grosbeak. There were a bunch more that I didn't try to squeeze in here. The birds were already recognizing the value of this habitat. I mentioned that the least abundant habitat type in the Northeast is thickets. And one of the things they're doing at Merck is creating new thickets. And what they've done here is they've cleared about an acre, taken the trees down, left the stuff on the ground. That acre backs up to another area that was cut about 6 years earlier that's now regenerated quite a bit. And just beyond that is an area that was cut 12 years earlier. So you've got this continuum of different plant successional phases. And what he was catching on his Merlin there, in particular, were two birds of special conservation need here in New England. Eastern towhees and chestnut-sided warblers. These are birds that have seen significant decreases across their range because they're early successional thicket habitat specialists. If you don't have thickets, you don't have these birds in any number. And in fact, I think range-wide eastern towhees have dropped by about 15%, according to eBird status and trends at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They're down by about 4% or 5% in Vermont. Chestnut-sided warblers in the last 10 years down by about 4 or 5% also in Vermont. So these are species that are going the wrong way. We need more of that habitat. As they showed at Merck, if you create that habitat, the birds can come there and they can breed successfully. Does this work at a landscape scale? It does. And I'm going to take you away from New England just a little bit here to give you an example of how well it can work. This is a map showing what's known as the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture. The JVs are public-private partnerships between state and federal and in some cases, in provincial in Canada, agencies, NGOs, private landowners working toward bird conservation. And what the Appalachian Mountain JV has been doing over the last few years is working on what they call focal lands. And these are about 10 million acres spread across 8 states in the mid-Atlantic and the South, from New York on south. And they're doing intensive forest management for birds and other at-risk species in those habitats. And one of the species that they've been focusing on are wood thrushes. And I remember how I said how poorly wood thrushes have been doing decade after decade after decade after decade. Well, here's some good news for you. This is an eBird status and trend map from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology showing wood thrush population change over the last 10 years. Everything in blue are increasing wood thrush populations. Range-wide, wood thrush populations are up about 12.5%. In places like West Virginia, and you can see how really dark blue it is in southern Ohio and West Virginia, where a lot of that focal landscape work is being done by the Appalachian Mountain JV, their populations are up by more than 20%. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat this, because if you've also probably noticed, there's a lot of red up here in this neck of the woods. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, places like Connecticut, wood thrush populations are down by almost 27%. Well, I mean, that's just such a heavily urbanized area now. There's just so little good quality wood thrush habitat left there. But, even up in Vermont, Vermont's wood thrush population in the last 10 years has dropped about 12.5%, almost 13%. I suspect part of the reason for that is all of those birds breeding in all of that woodland in the Adirondacks, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. Those birds are migrating south through that megalopolis, migrating south through probably the most heavily developed part of North America. But there could be other reasons. We don't know what's going on necessarily on the wintering grounds. But we have the technology now to start to figure out. And one of the more exciting things that's happening right now is something called the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System. Anybody here, anybody heard of MODIS? Okay, for those of you who haven't, the MODIS system is run by Birds Canada, basically like the Audubon Society of Canada, and it employs this network of now something like 2,000 or 3,000 automated receiver stations from the Arctic all the way down to South America, and hyper-miniaturized tiny little transmitters, again, that are small enough in some cases to put on butterflies and bats and migratory birds of all sorts, and track them across landscape distances. And I've been working for the last 8 or 9 years through a group called the Northeast MODIS Collaboration. We've built about 163 of these receiver stations from New England all the way south into the mid-Atlantic. But all of that infrastructure is now allowing us to track these migratory animals across landscape and hemispheric distances. And so we can start to ask and answer some big questions. And right now we're in the middle of a multi-year project. It's being organized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where collaborators all across North America, this is a picture from Missouri, but Audubon Vermont is working on this as well. They're tagging wood thrushes across the breeding range over all of North America, as well as on the wintering grounds in Central America, and seeing exactly where these different regional populations go. We know that birds often exhibit what's called migratory connectivity, where the birds that breed in one distinct regional, one distinct area on the breeding grounds will winter in a single distinct area on the wintering grounds. And if there's a problem down there, that regional population can start to collapse. That may be what we're seeing with wood thrushes here in the Northeast. We don't know, but we're on the cusp of starting to understand. But I don't want to take away from the fact that for wood thrushes as a whole, we have turned an enormous corner. For as long as I can remember as a bird conservationist, we've been lamenting the steady, steady, steady decline of wood thrushes. And across most of their range, they're going up. We can turn the map blue for more birds. All we need to do is support wise management of our forests up here, wise management, organic management of our farmland, support the folks down in Central America who are raising coffee in a way that supports bird health and small family farms down there by seeking out and buying specifically Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center shade-grown coffee. Times like this, sometimes hope is hard to find. So I want to leave you with one final story here about an extraordinary, I would argue the biggest conservation victory in the history of conservation victories that's happening just across the border in Canada, in the boreal forest where many of our migrant birds are going to. And it's not just a story of conservation success, but a story of social justice as well. I want to take you to the boreal forest of Canada, which is at 1.5 billion acres, the largest intact forest on the planet. It's bigger than the Amazon, it's bigger than the Congo. It is a bird factory of global significance. Every year, somewhere between 3 and 5 billion birds of more than 300 species, and why is that not advancing? All right, there we go. When in doubt, just push a button. Between 3 and 5 billion birds of more than 300 species nest in the boreal forest of Canada. lesser yellowlegs, Cape May warbler, Tennessee warbler, Swainson's thrush, common loon. I mean, the list goes on. Whooping cranes, surf scoters, just an incredible array of birds. And of course, this is also a place that's been home for millennia to indigenous communities from one end to the other. There's no such thing as there's no such thing as wilderness in this continent. There never was wilderness when the Europeans arrived. It was heavily inhabited then and is today. Of course, these are people who for more than 2 centuries have been marginalized and abused and unable to assert their rights, and many of them have simply decided they've had enough. And so across the boreal forest, we're seeing a resurgence of indigenous-led conservation. This is a picture from Thadenenene National Park Reserve on Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. About 6 years ago, the Lutzelk'e-Dene First Nation and a number of other neighboring First Nations reached an agreement with Parks Canada to create a 6 million acre National Park Reserve, which is in turn surrounded by huge areas of territorial wildlife protected land and territorial wildlife land. It's an enormous chunk of the forest, but even more than that, what happened at Thadenenene and elsewhere across Canada has sparked what's known as Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, where we're talking about hundreds of millions of acres that are being placed into formal protection and being managed by the people who have lived there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In some cases, they're doing this in partnership with the Canadian government. In other places, they're simply declaring it based on their own inherent right under treaty. Things are a little bit different in Canada as far as native treaties than here in the US. Seal River Watershed in Manitoba, just to the west of Churchill, is the size of Nova Scotia, 50,000 square kilometers. And just within the last year, the Seal River Watershed Alliance, which is a collaborative of 4 First Nations groups, have reached agreement with the Canadian government to create what will be one of the largest IPCAs. By the end of this decade, close to 1 billion acres in the Canadian boreal forest will be in some form of pledged or formal conservation protection. So that is a huge win for birds, and it is a huge win for the people like my friend Pete Enzo, who have lived there, their people have lived there for time out of mind. And so I think with that, I will leave you there with an optimistic story of bird conservation at a time when we could all probably use a little bit of optimism.